The Trojan War had already killed countless renowned warriors, but no loss had the impact of the fall of the Trojan prince Hector. Without the protection of their leader, the morale of the Trojan people was shattered. The armistice proposed by Achilles, which allowed Hector's funeral to take place, was coming to an end. Agamemnon took his men to the front of the Trojan walls and tried to challenge his opponents to a fight in the open field. But the Trojans didn't have the courage to come out from behind the mighty walls built by the gods. They saw Thanatos' terrible shadow at every corner, a sign that the ruin of the city was about to happen. King Priam regretted that he had lost so many sons in the war, but his grief was even greater that only his most cowardly sons had survived, Pyrrhus and Deiphobus. In their hands would be the future of Troy, since the king did not want to give the city's command to the brave Aeneans. After all, there was a prophecy where he would be the great upholder of Trojan tradition, and the king had no wish to give that honor to Anchises' son. But as the goddess Aurora appeared, bringing with her the rising of a new day, a fresh hope appeared on the horizon. They were the brave and untamed Amazons, tremendous warriors, daughters of Ares who fought on wild horses. Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons, was beautiful, and her armor reflected the sun's rays. She even looked like the daughter of the goddess Aurora. The emergence of the dreadful warriors who feared no man filled the Trojan warriors' hearts with courage. Led by Ares' daughters, the Trojans came out from behind the walls to once again face the Greek army. The Amazons advanced against the Greek lines, who were stunned to see an army of women mounted on horses. Their attack was frightening, seeming to be inspired by Ares, their father and bellicose god. The Greeks began to flee to ships, pursued by Queen Penthesilea, who killed dozens of warriors with her glorious axe offered by the god of war. Achilles and Ajax were surprised by the Greeks' disorderly flight. They shouted for the men to re-establish the defensive lines, for Achilles and Ajax were now in their army's forefront. Encouraged by the two great heroes, the Greeks returned to the fight, and a great bloodbath began. Achilles, Trojans, and Amazons spilled blood on Trojan soil in one of the most violent battles of the war. Achilles again began to turn the battle in favor of the Greeks, using Peleus' fabulous spear. But Penthesilea feared no man. Not even the fearsome son of Thetis frightened the queen of the Amazons. Mounted on her horse, she hurled a spear at the hero. Achilles blocked the attack and ordered his war chariot to be brought to him. The objective was to hunt down the brave Amazon. Pulled by the divine horses Balius and Xanthus, Achilles pursued the warrior queen, who continued to hurl projectiles at him. Penthesilea turned around and raised her axe. Achilles was impressed by the courage of the fearless warrior, who looked more like Athena's incarnation. The queen of the Amazons fearlessly charged forward against the champion of the gods for the final showdown. Achilles pierced the horse's body and struck the Amazon's belly in a blow delivered by his mighty spear. The queen and her horse fell mortally wounded. Achilles approached to examine Penthesilea's body. He could not believe that a woman would have the courage to challenge him. When even the mighty Hector trembled in his presence, he removed the queen's helmet and was surprised. Not only was she really a woman, but she was one of the most beautiful girls he had ever seen. Achilles was touched by the queen's courage, and so he did not strip her of her weapons and armor, as was his custom. Achilles returned Penthesilea's body to her subjects so that they could arrange a funeral to honor the woman's greatness. She had been braver than most of the great men who fought in the war. After defeating the fearless Amazon warriors, the Greeks began preparations for the assault on the Trojan walls. Many tall ladders began to be manufactured for the warriors to reach the top of the walls. In Troy, the high-ranking nobility of Ilium were desperate. Some said that Helen of Troy should be handed over to the Greeks so that their fury could be controlled, avoiding a terrible fate for the city of Troy. But Pyrrhus found all this inconceivable. He said that returning Helen would in no way diminish the Greek warriors' bloodlust. At that moment, the Ethiopian prince Memnon appeared, leading his army of African warriors. He had skin as dark as ebony. He was strong as a bull, so strong that he could only be compared to Achilles. And just like the son of Thetis, Memnon also had divine blood. He was the son of the goddess Aurora with Tithonus, brother of King Priam of Troy. And, like the Greek, he also had divine armor made by the god of forges. Memnon led his men in a bloody battle against the Greeks. The Dark Prince claimed dozens of Greek lives. He seemed unstoppable, and the Greeks were taken aback, for they did not think they would ever again face an enemy as strong as Hector. Achilles wanted to face him, but was stopped by his divine mother. She warned him that this enemy could kill him in the next 24 hours. Therefore, Memnon fought on, without finding any opponent to match him. On his chariot, the old king Nestor of Pylos commanded the Greek lines, trying to prevent them from being overthrown by the pressure of the African army. The Ethiopian prince realized that, if he eliminated the Greek commander, the opponents would be left leaderless, and the Africans would be victorious. Memnon advanced against Nestor, but his son Antilochus placed himself between the warrior and his old father to protect him. The African prince pierced the chest of Nestor's brave son with his spear. The old king tried to push Memnon away from his son's body, preventing him from plundering the spoils. The Ethiopian said that he would not have attacked the old king. Due to the heat of the battle, he had only charged at him because he did not realize that he was an elder. Antilochus, like Patroclus, was very dear to Achilles. Therefore, the great Greek warrior forgot his mother's advice and tried to take revenge by fighting Memnon. The two great warriors began their duel, and the Ethiopian prince proved to be a formidable opponent. He was strong and skilled. Achilles felt that this warrior seemed to equal him in almost everything. That fighter might be destined to kill him, just as it had been prophesied since his childhood. Achilles used his spear to strike the African prince in the shoulder. But the blow only made Memnon fight with even more devotion, unlike any other opponent. Thetis and Aurora watched the duel between their sons with distress. They knew that only one would come out of the fight alive. Both asked Zeus to favor their respective sons, but he said that the fate of each warrior was already determined by the Moirai. Not even he could go against the Ladies of Destiny. Memnon wounded Achilles' hand with his spear, and the Greeks were shocked to see the divine champion bleeding so badly. The goddess of dawn stood behind her son and revealed Achilles' secret weakness, his heels. Memnon tried to surprise his opponent with an assault on his heels, but Achilles, the light-footed warrior, leapt on his opponent. With one terrible blow, he claimed Memnon's life. The body of the African prince was carried away by the deities of the winds. So, just like Sarpedon, he was buried with all the honors he deserved. After defeating that mighty warrior, nothing seemed impossible for Achilles, who would now lead the assault on the walls of Troy in search of ultimate glory. Achilles commanded the Trojan offensive in the final assault on the walls of Troy. He wanted to conquer the city that day, and everything looked favorable. Using their long ladders, the Greeks began trying to scale the walls. while the Trojans mounted desperate defenses. Aeneas led the Trojans outside the walls. If they could not destroy the great stairs, the city would be lost. Achilles, with his dreadful blows, kept sending Trojans to the kingdom of Hades. The defenders' fortitude was weakening. Afraid of dying, the Trojans began to flee, while Achilles impaled them with Peleus' spear. Suddenly, Apollo appeared before Achilles and ordered him to stop the advance, for it was written in destiny that he would never overcome the Trojan walls. But Achilles ignored him and told the god to go back to the other deities. If he tried to stop him, Apollo would have a taste of Peleus' spear. Apollo gave way to the senseless Greek warrior. But he could not let him get away with such an insult. The excellent archer Pyrrhus focused as hard as he could. With the help of the luminous god, he fired a devastating arrow. Guided by Apollo, the prince's arrow hit Achilles' heel, his only weak point. Achilles was practically invulnerable, for his divine mother had performed a ritual where he was submerged in the waters of the sacred river. But the only unprotected part of his body was his heel, for it had not come into contact with the water. Mortally wounded, his blood flowed abundantly in the stricken area. Achilles called the one who struck him from behind, and at a safe distance, a coward, for his opponent did not have the courage to meet him face to face. Achilles still managed to stand up. He staggered forward against his enemies, managing to kill a few more enemies before running out of strength. To everyone's surprise, Achilles tumbled to the ground, and the sound of the impact of his armor against the ground was heard throughout the battlefield. The greatest of all heroes was dead. Paris celebrated the victory over the best Greek warrior and ordered the Trojans to plunder Achilles' weapons and armor. The Trojan soldiers, who had previously fled, rushed to pillage the hero's body. Ajax appeared on the scene, raising his mighty warhammer to scare away the Trojans trying to snatch Achilles' body. Odysseus gave cover to the strong Ajax so that he could put Achilles' body on his shoulders and set off for the Greek camp. Ajax used his enormous strength to quickly cross all the way to the camp. Many said that, for this heroic feat, he would pay a terrible price. Completely exhausted, Ajax accomplished his mission and rescued the body of his dear friend. Achilles' body received due care and was mourned by all the Greeks who grieved the departure of the most glorious warrior among them. Thetis appeared in the sea waters to bid farewell to the son she had tried so hard to divert from his fate. She covered her son's body with her tears, and everyone present was moved by that mournful scene. Achilles was cremated on a huge funeral pyre, worthy of the greatest of kings. His bones were buried next to the remains of his beloved friend Patroclus. They met again on the Elysian fields. After Achilles' funeral, the goddess Thetis, the hero's mother, offered her son's armor to the Achaeans. It was to be given to the one who had rendered the greatest assistance to Peleus and Thetis' son. Ajax considered himself the only man worthy of such honor, for it was he who had taken the hero's body from the grip of the Trojan warriors. But Odysseus objected, and said that he himself was the one who deserved to inherit Achilles' breastplate. Ajax was furious with Odysseus. He claimed that the comparison between the two was preposterous, as it would be the same as equating a dog to a lion. The giant also said that, if it were not for him, Achilles would have his head on a stake, and his spirit would roam the banks of the river Acheron. But Odysseus replied by saying that, if it were not for him, who contained nearly a dozen Trojans, Ajax would never be able to carry the body, and that it was he who found Achilles and convinced him to fight. Without that, the entire Greek expedition would have been lost. Old Nestor suggested a competition to decide who was most worthy of such an honor. Ajax and Odysseus spoke before everyone, defending their causes. Ajax was brave and worthy, but he did not possess the power of speech. But Odysseus had a silver tongue and charmed everyone with his words. Menelaus and Agamemnon convinced the council to give Odysseus their weapons. Some did so to prevent Ajax from getting even more prestige and power. Upon seeing Odysseus being presented with Hephaestus's divine armor, Ajax's blood boiled to such an extent that he felt ill, even having a stroke. He became motionless in front of everyone and had facial paralysis. In his tent, he seemed to recover from his malaise, but he was still outraged at the humiliation he had suffered. He wanted to make the Atridae pay for conspiring against him. At that moment, the goddess Athena appeared behind him and clouded his judgment. Ajax was completely beside himself. He came out of the tent with his weapon, determined to take revenge. Two of Agamemnon's guards tried to stop him but failed. He suddenly saw Atreus's two sons, who seemed startled to see Ajax's hateful face. The giant lunged forward with bloodlust against Menelaus and Agamemnon. Ajax mortally struck Menelaus. Then he strangled Agamemnon until he took away his last breath of life. Even after killing the two sons of Atreus, Ajax's thirst for revenge remained unquenchable. He went to Odysseus's tent and dragged him out. His opponent would not die as quickly as the others. He tied him to a rock and began to whip him. That's when the Athena-induced confusion dissipated, and Ajax realized that he was flogging a ram. And everyone witnessed the grotesque scene in shock. As he killed the other lambs, he thought the animals were Menelaus and Agamemnon, for he shouted their names during the slaughter. Again humiliated before everyone, he ran back to his tent. He called his slave Tecmessa, whom he had taken as his wife, and he said that he could not stand the humiliation, so he would depart from the world. His wife and son would have to seek out Teucer, his brother, so that the Greek leaders would not enslave them. Ajax held a sword against his chest and threw himself to the ground against it. The war's second greatest warrior, second only to Achilles, died. Agamemnon wanted to deny him the right to the funeral because he had betrayed everyone, and that had it not been for Athena confounding him, Ajax would have killed him, plus his brother. But Odysseus convinced the supreme leader to bury the hero with all the honors of a great fighter. Had it not been for Ajax and his great shield, the Trojans would have burned all the Greek ships. Thanks to the intervention of the king of Ithaca, the mighty Ajax was veiled and honored as a great warrior. The Greek leaders were worried. The death of two of their most powerful warriors, Achilles and Ajax, made it almost impossible to conquer the city of Troy. Although they had weakened their opponents, something beyond their comprehension prevented the Achaeans from overcoming the Trojan wall. With Odysseus's help, the seer Chalcus learned of the prophecies of Helenus, the seer who was Priam's son. They ensured the safety of the city of Ilium. Chalcus revealed to the Greek leaders that Troy could only be conquered by men using the weapons of the great hero Hercules. Furthermore, the city would not fall without having someone with the blood of the great Achilles. And there was also a sacred artifact that protected the city. It was the Palladium, kept inside Troy, in Athena's temple. Odysseus, who at no time ever wanted to take part in the war, wanted to end it quickly. He said he would find the solution to all those shenanigans. The king of Ithaca headed in his ship to King Lycomedes's palace, the same place where he had found Achilles, hidden among the king's daughters. He came across a young man. This one was training against two strong opponents at the same time. The warriors, although experienced, could not hold the young warrior back. He was not just anybody. His name was Pyrrhus, and the Greeks called him Neoptolemus, which meant the new warrior. In his veins he had Achilles' blood, father of the young warrior with the princess Didymia. The princess felt a déjà vu when she saw Odysseus recruiting her son for war, just as he had done with her beloved Achilles. Odysseus handed the boy his father's weapons and armor, which were in his custody. He said that the lives of thousands of Greeks depended on the lad. Pyrrhus would not allow his father's sacrifice to be in vain and agreed to accompany Odysseus to Troy. Meanwhile, a new reinforcement had arrived to help the Trojans. The warrior Eurypylus brought with him fresh troops, sent by allied cities to Troy. With few heroes to take the lead, the Greeks began to give way before the enemy. They were not ready to contain that renewed force. Suddenly, the Trojans and allies halted their advance. They couldn't believe their eyes. Achilles seemed to have returned from the dead. Pyrrhus, who was wearing his father's armor, let out a powerful battle cry. The enemies began to flee, fearing death. But Eurypylus tried to stop the flight, saying that they were fleeing from a child wearing his father's robes. Eurypylus advanced against Neoptolemus, who did not hesitate to face him. The young Pyrrhus leaped on his enemy. With one perfect blow, he struck Eurypylus lethally. The witnesses to that scene had no doubt. Pyrrhus was the son of the glorious Achilles. With Neoptolemus's arrival, the morale of the Greek warriors improved. The Trojans hid behind the walls again. Pyrrhus had a triumphant debut on the battlefields once dominated by his late father. The Greeks now carried a new warrior on their shoulders, celebrating victory. The first hurdle had been cleared. Now Odysseus needed to find Hercules' weapons. The king of Ithaca knew where he had last found one of them, but he also knew that it would not be easy to convince the owner to take it to the Trojan shores. After taking Achilles' son to Troy, Odysseus had to undertake a mission that would cause him great embarrassment. He was to find Hercules' weapons, and he knew very well where they were. On the island of Lemnos was Philoctetes, the warrior who had been abandoned there almost 10 years ago because of his snake injury. He felt a great hatred for Odysseus, responsible for his having been left behind. Odysseus asked the hero for forgiveness, for Philoctetes was heir to Hercules' bow, and his magnificent arrows bathed in the Lernaean Hydra's blood. But the forsaken hero would not pardon the Greeks. He turned his back on Odysseus and said he would not travel to Troy. Hercules, who after his death went to live with the gods, spoke in Philoctetes' ear. He told him that he had given him the bow to take him to Troy, and that his destiny would be fulfilled that way. After Hercules' intervention, Odysseus took Philoctetes and the divine bow to the shores of Troy. The serpent wound, the reason for his abandonment, still had a putrid odor. But Philoctetes was miraculously treated by the best physician of the Greeks. The hero, who before could barely put his foot down, was completely cured. Everyone was amazed by the miracle. At that moment, the gods seemed to favor the Greeks. They were preparing for another assault on the walls of Troy. The protectors were weak, but the strong defensive position was a huge advantage. Aeneas led the Trojans and their allies in defending the base of the wall, preventing the Greeks from climbing it. Meanwhile, Paris provided cover for Aeneas, commanding the archers who fired the projectiles from the top of the wall. Neoptolemus embodied his father's spirit. By the start of the fight, he had already slaughtered more than 10 enemies. Paris seemed to be having a déjà vu. He had a feeling. if he could shoot down the mighty Achilles with his arrows, then he could also shoot down his son. Philoctetes, with his divine bow, would not allow the cowardly Trojan prince to bring down another Greek hero. He struck straight at the Trojan prince, who felt intense pain, much greater than a normal wound. Pyrrhus cried out in pain as he was accosted by his brother Deiphobus, but they did not know that the arrow had been bathed in the poisonous blood of the Hydra of Lerna. Few people in the world knew the antidote to that poison. The Trojans managed to repel the Greek attack, but the prince and heir to the throne lay dying on his bed. No Trojan physician knew how to help him. Pyrrhus remembered Oenon, the nymph to whom he had vowed love before he met Helen. She knew the secrets of herbs and could cure any ailment. Pyrrhus was carried on a stretcher to the nymph's dwelling at the foot of Mount Ida. The Trojan prince threw himself at Oenon's feet and begged for help, but time and bitterness had hardened the nymph's heart. She told the prince to seek salvation in Helen, whom he had chosen as his wife. With great pain in her heart, Oenon refused to render aid to the only love of her life. By the time the men carrying Pyrrhus returned to Troy, the prince's spirit had departed for Hades. Helen mourned the death of Pyrrhus. Meanwhile, Deiphobus and his brother Helenus fought to decide who would be the new husband of the world's most beautiful woman. Pyrrhus's body burned on the funeral pyre. Hidden, the nymph Oenon saw everything. She felt enormous pain and guilt for having let her beloved Pyrrhus die. In an act of love and desperation, the nymph threw herself into the flames and burned to ashes, holding her beloved. Upon Pyrrhus's death, Helen was forced to marry Prince Deiphobus. An enormous sadness plagued Helen's heart, and she felt guilty for the mistakes she had made in the past, which had led to the deaths of thousands of men and were the root of tremendous unhappiness. At this stage of the war, the other women of Troy hated Helen. She could see the contempt in their eyes. She was held guilty for all the tragedy in the kingdom of Troy. Outside the walls, Odysseus pondered how he could break the last prophesied barrier that prevented the city from being taken. The city of Troy would not fall if they had the Palladium of Athena within their walls. But the cunning Odysseus devised a plan to enter the city. He needed the help of his friend Diomedes. Diomedes beat and whipped Odysseus as if he were the worst of criminals. This scourging was essential to Odysseus's plan. Odysseus put on a tattered tunic and knocked at the gates of Troy for help. The disguised Odysseus deceived the Trojans, saying he was a foreign merchant, captured by the Greeks while trying to smuggle supplies into Troy. He said he almost died after being tortured for days on end, but had managed to escape during the night. Helen, hearing that man's voice, was sure that she already knew him. To clear up any doubts, she said that her maids would take care of the visitor. Helen's handmaidens bathed Odysseus and tended to his wounds. When Odysseus put on the new clothes that were offered to him, Helen entered his quarters. Seeing the king of Ithaca clean and without his hood, she recognized him immediately. She told Odysseus to be quiet, for she would not alert the Trojans about the spy who was now within the walls. After all, she was there only as a slave. During the night, Odysseus sneaked to Athena's temple. With the help of the gods, the guard experienced a heavy sleep. Odysseus entered the temple and stole the Palladium that protected the city. In his escape from Troy, under Athena's protection, he eliminated the guards standing in his way, and the Palladium prophecy had been solved. After showing off the Palladium to all the Greek warriors, the leaders of the Achaeans motivated the troops to prepare for the ultimate assault on the city of Troy. The Trojan archers, standing on the walls, continued to repel the attempted assault. But the brilliant Odysseus came up with an innovative strategy. the Greek warriors advanced together, shoulder to shoulder, with their shields raised. They looked like a great turtle. The Trojans' arrows were useless against Odysseus's formation, and the soldiers went towards the gates. They began to strike the gate with axes and quickly brought it down. But Aeneas stood over the Trojan gate, asking the gods to help him stop the Greeks from conquering Troy that day. The Dardanian prince was empowered by the gods. Using this divine power, he pushed a large block of stone, causing it to fall from the top of the wall. The great impact of the block claimed the lives of nearly a dozen warriors and injured several others. Once again, the Greeks were repulsed. They fled, thinking that the gods did not wish Troy to fall into the Achaeans' hands. The Greek chiefs were extremely discouraged. The war was already 10 years old, and all their effort and sacrifice seemed to have been in vain. But Odysseus would again display all his genius by devising one of the most famous ruses in history. After 10 years of war, the Trojan sentries noticed during the night that a flash from many flames lit up the skies over the Greek camp. There were large columns of rising smoke, as something very strange was happening. The next morning, scouts called the Trojan nobles to contemplate the miracle that had happened. The Greek camp had been abandoned. The Achaeans had left. But in that desolate scene, a huge wooden horse stood out. The gigantic equine had been built from Greek ships, which no longer had sailors to command them, for they had perished in battle. That monument was certainly meant for the gods. They found a Greek man scourged and tied to a pole. He said his name was Sinon, and that he had been left behind as a sacrifice to the gods. This way the Achaeans could safely return home. Sinon was interrogated and asked why the Greeks had suddenly left after enduring a 10-year siege. He said that the Greeks had angered the goddess Athena, who was on their side. She was deeply offended by the theft of the Palladium, which was in the goddess's temple in Troy. As a result, a great plague spread among the Achaeans. Without divine support, the Achaeans realized it was impossible to conquer Troy and decided to return home. He said that the gigantic horse was an offering to the gods. Its shape was grandiose to prevent the Trojans from taking it to Troy. After all, the gods would certainly favor whoever possessed that tribute, and they feared that, with the gods siding with the Trojans, Troy would exact a ghastly revenge on the Greek city-states. King Priam, his nobles and priests, discussed what to do with the great wooden horse. Some wanted to burn it, but that would anger the gods. Others wanted to leave it where it was. But the glory of carrying that offering to the gods to the temple square in Troy was irresistible. Cassandra, the discredited priestess, begged the Trojans to burn the cursed monument, for it would ruin Troy. However, she was once again ignored, and they still scoffed at her, who had predicted years earlier Troy's defeat in the war. But the Trojans did not know that lurking inside the horse were dozens of Greek warriors. Among them were Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, Pyrrhus, and Epeius, a magnificent carpenter responsible for building the gigantic horse. With considerable effort, the Trojans pulled the horse up to the gates of the city. The great gate was partially demolished so that the huge horse could pass through it. In a nearby creek, the great Greek armada was hidden. Thousands of soldiers were waiting for the signal to attack. The great wooden horse was stationed in the center of the temple square inside the city of Troy, and a great feast began. The whole city celebrated the victory over the Greeks after 10 long years of war. The king opened the doors of the royal cellar and offered his entire stock of beverages to the people. Everyone was to celebrate that great day with joy and plenty. As night advanced, the city fell silent. The people of Troy were fast asleep after the long day of celebration. Suddenly, a trap door opened in the belly of the wooden horse. Dozens of warriors began to emerge from that hiding place. The Greeks stealthily initiated their way to control the city gates. The sentries were surprised to be attacked from behind by the heroes infiltrating the city. At the top of the wall, a signal fire was sent to the tens of thousands of warriors outside the walls. The gates had been conquered. Led by Agamemnon, the gigantic Greek army stormed the city and started a massive bloodbath. Unarmed young men and women were not spared. The bloodthirsty rage of the Achaeans seemed unlimited. Many Trojan men, even without proper weapons and armor, tried to stop the Greek advance. But Troy's fate seemed sealed. Nothing could stop them. Achilles' son led the men in the final assault on the royal palace, the last stronghold of Trojan resistance. The Trojan War was nearing its end. After invading the city of Troy, the Greeks indulged in scenes of extreme violence. Ares, the god of war, could not be more pleased with the rivers of blood that flowed through the city streets. Inside the royal palace, the Trojan nobility was terrified. They knew that the Greeks would be merciless. A terrible fate awaited all of King Priam's subjects. Aeneas led a heroic resistance, halting the advance of the Achaeans and buying time for many Trojan citizens to escape the city. All hope of victory for the Trojans had gone up in smoke. Achilles' son Odysseus and Menelaus broke down the door of the royal palace, and the goddess of victory stood beside them. Menelaus's blood boiled as he searched for Helen of Troy. He had an enormous desire for revenge. Odysseus was fighting the last men of the royal guard, who, even though outnumbered, offered strong resistance. While Neoptolemus cornered King Priam of Troy in the temple of Zeus, old King Priam raised his sword for the last time. The king's white hair did not move the son of Achilles, who pierced the old man's belly with his sword. Menelaus found Helen in the chamber of Prince Deiphobus, her new husband. The Spartan king wished to dye the room with the couple's red blood. Deiphobus raised his sword and advanced against Menelaus, but he didn't stand a chance against Ares' apprentice warrior, who killed the prince as if he slaughtered a pig. Helen came face to face with the man she betrayed and abandoned. Menelaus was bathed in Deiphobus's blood and huffed like an angry bull. The queen of Sparta was resigned, for she knew that her destiny was Hades. But the gods had not yet abandoned Helen of Troy. Her ally, the goddess Aphrodite, caused an aura to emerge around Helen. This aura emphasized all the exuberant beauty of the Spartan queen, almost blinding Menelaus. Repentant for her actions, Helen offered her body to Menelaus's blade. The son of Atreus could not consummate his revenge, for he was still in love with this woman. Seeing her husband falter, Helen embraced him and asked for forgiveness, saying that she still loved him. Without speaking a word, Menelaus dropped his weapon and accepted the embrace of the woman he loved so much, to the point of driving two nations to war. The battle for the royal palace was over. All the descendants of the Trojan nobility were dead. None of King Priam's sons had survived. Queen Hecuba, the prophetess Cassandra, and the princess Andromache had been arrested and their fate handed over to the Greek leaders to be shared as slaves. But the fate of Astyanax, son of the great hero Hector, was still uncertain. He was the last living heir of Priam's lineage. With victory accomplished, the Greeks pillaged and burned Troy to the ground. Aeneas managed to escape the city, carrying Anchises, his crippled old father, on his back, and hauling his son, Asanius. He fled to distant lands, giving rise to a proud people known as the Romans. As Troy burned in flames, The goddesses Hera and Athena rejoiced that they had achieved their longed-for revenge against Troy. Agamemnon was pleased by his large share of Troy's plunder. He also received Cassandra, a prophetess whom the Trojans ignored, leading them to such a hideous fate. But one last sad and terrible scene put an end to the war. Astyanax was torn from the arms of Andromache, who wept in despair. From atop the walls of Troy, Neoptolemus hurled the poor child towards certain death. The Greeks agreed that they could not leave the last heir of Priam's house alive. After all, Hector's blood ran in the child's veins, and if he grew up as strong as his father, his revenge on the Achaeans would be terrible. After 10 years of war, the Greek heroes and their men returned to Hellas. Despite the many glories and treasures, the return home was difficult. United, they fought for the honor of their land. For millennia, the Muses would inspire idos and minstrels to sing the deeds of the great men who sacrificed their blood at Troy. Those achievements became immortal.